Good evening, everyone, and welcome to This Thinking, Trans Kids, what's been happening inside the Tavistock. For many people, it's maybe your first thinking. My name is James Harding. I'm the editor and one of the co-founders of Tortoise, a slow newsroom. And in fact, as I was sitting down this evening, I was thinking to myself that one of the very first think-ins we held was actually on the question of trans. It was called The Question of Gender: Who Decides Who We Are? And that was much more, I suppose, around perceptions of gender dysphoria, but also about discrimination against trans people. And I suppose that in the course of the last year or two, we've kept coming back to those themes. Last autumn, we published a long examination of the tweets and writing of J.K. Rowling and the Twitter storm and cancel culture and arguments around her intervention. But this evening, I think we're trying to do something different. We're trying not to understand discrimination. We're not trying to understand perception as much as we're trying to understand the behavior of institutions. And in particular, the NHS, the preeminent clinic for people with gender dysphoria, the Tavistock. We're trying to understand the role of the courts, and I suppose more broadly government in making decisions in this area. And so we're really grateful that a number of people with personal experience and expertise are joining us this evening. In a moment, I'm going to come to Joe and Tyler, who was treated at the Tavistock and can tell us firsthand of that experience. Many of you will have seen Stella O'Malley's documentary for Channel 4 on trans kids. And again, I'm really grateful that we've got someone with Stella's experience to come and help talk us through it. The one thing, of course, we really wanted was to get the Tavistock to come and join us. The Tavistock, we spoke to them a number of times. They said they couldn't join us. We did ask them also for a certain piece of data and information, and again, they were unable to provide it. I think we're aware that there is a CQC report, a Care Quality Commission report, that is coming this week. That obviously is likely to be highly sensitive, and that might have informed their decision. What they did say is they won't participate, but they might join us anonymously to listen in. So that's just to make everyone clear about the position of the Tavistock. In those circumstances, what we did, or what I've done, is ask my colleague, Alexi Mostras, who's an editor and partner at Tortoise, to try and help us through the Court of Appeal findings that were delivered at the end of last year as regards the prescription of puberty blockers by the Tavistock to people between the ages of 10 and 20. And Alexi, would you just talk us through exactly what the findings of that ruling were, and I suppose what the questions were that were raised by it?
Sure. Thanks, James. Well, the Bell case, as it was known, centred around the application of something called Gillick competency, which is a legal test to determine whether a child can consent to medical procedures. And in this case, the question was whether a child between the ages of 10 or 16, or a young person aged 16 to 18, could consent to the use of puberty blockers to treat gender dysphoria. And if they could, in principle, what information they needed in order for their consent to be informed consent. Now, as almost everyone in this room will know, or at least quite a few people in this virtual room will know, the court found that there were enormous difficulties in a child under 16 having enough knowledge to be able to consent legally to such treatment. So most children in that bracket, the judge found, would simply be too young and too immature to grasp the full implications of taking puberty blockers, including their experimental nature, and the strong likelihood that a child who took puberty blockers would go on to take cross-sex hormones. And the court's decision in practice means that a child under the age of 16 who suffers from gender dysphoria now cannot go on to puberty blockers without the consent of a judge. So that was the main finding, but the court made several other observations which I think are relevant for this thinking, in that they examine processes and they arguably raise questions about the behavior and the function of GIDS and the Tavistock. And it won't take long, but I pulled out 5 points from the judgment that might be relevant to how we discuss things going forward. So firstly, the court noted that in just a 9-year period, there's been a 25-fold increase in the number of children and young people referred to GIDS, which is part of the Tavistock Trust. So in 2009, 97 children and young people were referred. In 2018, that figure had leapt to 2,519. So I suppose, how far did GIDS go towards understanding the reasons behind this huge increase? What clinical implications and issues did that increase raise? Secondly, in the last 8 years, the court found that the gender split in referrals to GIDS had shifted from roughly 50-50 between natal boys and girls in 2011 to last year, when 76% of the referrals were natal female. So the court found that GIDS didn't really have any clinical explanation for such a significant change. And perhaps one question today should be, how far has it gone to understand why now significantly more natal girls want to transition? Third, the court noted that some 13% of referrals to the GIDS service in 2012, so quite a long time ago, recorded some sort of autistic spectrum disorder. And the judges again expressed surprise that GIDS had no updated statistics on the proportion of young people they now referred for puberty blockers who also had a diagnosis of autism. So that in itself is another data issue. And there's a third data issue that is the fourth thing from the judgment that we should note, which is that GIDS had no real data on the proportion of children on puberty blockers who then progress to cross-sex hormones. So the judges took evidence from the Netherlands, where the proportion is very low. There's only 1.9% of adolescents who start puberty suppression do not go on to CSH. So I suppose a question could be, was it fair of GIDS, was it reasonable of GIDS to treat puberty blockers and CSH as two distinct and different stages of treatment, when in practice the court found that almost all the young people who took one went on to take the other? And fifthly and finally, the court found that there was a lack of clarity in how GIDS described the objective of puberty blocking treatments. Did they provide a pause to think, or was it a treatment to limit the need for greater surgical intervention later? Were GIDS information sheets too quick to paint puberty blockers as a safe, reversible treatment with a well-established history, when the court noted that actually only one study from Amsterdam had ever looked at how puberty blockers were used specifically to treat gender dysphoria, as opposed to precocious puberty, which is where the majority of the medical evidence sat? And why did it take until June 2020 for the NHS website to state that actually little is known about the long-term side effects of puberty blockers in children with gender dysphoria? So when I'm making these points, it should also be pointed out that the court took evidence from several young people who told them that GIDS clinicians had behaved impeccably, had given them the information. And one child said that taking puberty blockers potentially saved her life, all of which goes to show, I think, that for me, the wider issues raised by the Bell case are incredibly difficult and complex. But in terms specifically of the processes and for the questions for the Tavistock, that those perhaps are the main points raised in the judgment.
Alexi, thank you. Thanks so much. It's really helpful. As you can see, my colleague Phoebe Davis has shared the Tavistock ruling so you can read it, but Alexi, you've saved us some time in actually going through the detail of that. For those of you who've not been to a think-in before, I should just say the aim of it is to be a forum for civilized disagreement. People will come at this, no doubt, with different points of view. It's also intended to be a system of organized listening. And typically, we're quite insistent on the idea that people should register their names, we should be able to see you. We do appreciate that there's some people in the context of this conversation who frankly would like to contribute anonymously. Obviously, on the understanding that it still remains civilized, please do so. You may do so in the chat. You may do so if you choose to by raising your hand. The whole nature of a think-in is that we want to hear from as many people as possible over the course of the hour. So please do say what you think. I'll bring you in. I can already see someone called Emery is talking about their experience of this, and I'd love to bring them in a moment. But as I said at the top, you know, I'm really grateful to Tyler and his mum Jo, because it gives us a chance actually to hear firsthand what your experience of treatment at the Tavistock was like. And I'd like to, if we can, between the two of you, just would you talk us through what your experiences was, and then I'm going to come on, if I might, just ask you what you think overall of the service that the Tavistock operates.
I would say my experience firsthand was nothing but positive. I would say it was a lifeline for me. And I can obviously only talk about my experience, but I have nothing but good things to say about the Tavistock and the way I was treated and the way I was carefully dealt with, and everything that needed to be explained to me was explained to me. And I couldn't be more grateful for the service, especially the free service that we have in this country, as I know a lot of people, you know, in other countries in the USA, that imagine living somewhere else and not having this service available to me when I did.
So I think the thing I'd like to add to that is that, you know, the pathway that I think we experienced was the one that was the ideal optimum. And I think, you know, there were no failings. Every single thing was explained to us. We had an incredibly long wait in order to be seen. So initially, Tyler had been picked up or supported by our local CAM, Child and Adolescent Mental Health Services, because he was experiencing a lot of distress, and I think was self-harming and was quite a significant suicide risk because of his gender dysphoria. Now, we talk about this, and Tyler's happy that I use that kind of language just to frame that. So, you know, I know other parents who've got trans kids who cope differently with, you know, with puberty. Tyler was incredibly distressed in having periods and was self-harming, and I was really struggling as a parent to know how to prevent him from ending his life. That's the bottom line. We waited more than 9 months to get that first appointment, and I say, even though CAMS were really supportive, they were very clear that they didn't have that gender specialist advice and expertise. So you know, that the first stages that you took were around social transition being the most important thing for you. And I think the point at which you came out to me as trans, I think, you know, I said, wow, what does that mean? What do I do? As a parent, I didn't understand what was going on for you. Tyler took me on that journey. As a family, we went on that journey together. So there's lots of things I think that are being said about people's experiences that were not ours, that, you know, in terms of being rushed. And I think that, you know, those waiting times are longer, but people aren't rushed into anything. I think every single step was considered. We had so many discussions about what they knew about hormone blockers, whether it was a pause, whether it was, you know, prevented the need for or more surgery further on. I think, you know, we went through about 10 months of counselling. We didn't jump to anything. And I think the ideal intervention, which isn't what all trans kids need, but it's what you needed, and you got that. And you're here now as a testament to that.
Yes,
and for those people who don't know, and I am one of those people, can you just talk through exactly what the timings were? You mentioned the 9-month wait, Joe, but Tyler, how old were you when you started transitioning? How old were you when you referred to the Tavistock? And then at what point did the medical intervention, puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, when did that begin?
I came out when I was 14 years old. I'm now currently 19. I first of all got referred to, as my mum said, to CAMS first, which was for a separation, but I think they tied together. I first had 10 months of intervention from Tavistock. When I got referred, they spoke about everything in detail that I needed to know. And when I first came out, the first thing I thought about wasn't, oh, I need to go on hormone blockers. I didn't know exactly what it meant when I realized I was trans. I didn't think straight away about the surgical aspects or the medical aspects of transitioning. I just knew who I was supposed to be. And there was a lengthy, I'd almost call it brutal. It was intensive. They went through every single aspect of my life, every single thing that's happened in my life, to try and almost, you know, try and explore every other option that it could be, other being than trans, you know, anything it could else be.
And again, I think Tyler's very clear that you know, he is male. Obviously, not all trans kids. Some are gender questioning, some are non-binary, some are gender fluid. But it was you know, the interventions we had with it, and we saw 2 clinicians every single time, and we saw the same 2. We were under the TAVI for 3.5 years. So
I didn't start hormone blockers until I was 15. So
until what age, Tyler?
I was 15.
15. So,
Yes.
so can I just, sorry, did I mishear you? Did you say 15 or 16?
15.
15. So there are though, and I'm going to come to this, and just so people are aware, I see in the conversation Kelly J wants to weigh in, Sue, Emery. I'm going to make sure I come to all of you in a moment. But there are these 2 arguments that in response to the court ruling. Right? One is, I think, sort of picks up the tone of your point about waiting for 9 months and the concern amongst some people with gender dysphoria that says this is going to make things even slower. We're going to have to wait even longer, and that's quite traumatic. Right? And the other part of it is to say, look, there's such a big set of changes, perhaps in the way that Alexi set out, the number of people who are referring to GIDS, and also the experimental nature of the treatment without a full understanding of its implications, and the application of that to very young people. 15, as you'll admit, is young, but some of the people taking puberty blockers were considerably younger. And I wonder whether, when you step back, I'm going to ask you first, Tyler, whether you can say, look, I personally got great care, but do you understand the question of whether or not the Tavistock itself is open to the scrutiny and collecting the information and data that's probably necessary for a public service like that?
I do think that, obviously I can only speak from my experience, but I don't think that there is, you know, a set age where you figure out who you are. I think people realise they're trans in their 50s. People realise it younger than I did. And I mean, I think it is a journey for every single person, and it's different for everyone. So I can't really say, you know, there's a time that it will happen. So, I mean, you know, everyone figures out things at different times. Do you want to add?
Yeah, but I think, you know, it is disappointing if they don't have the data, because interestingly, we got to the point when we thought there isn't anything else they can't ask us that they have, and they asked us again, and we revisited, you know, what makes you think you're male? How does that feel for you? What does that look like? I think in terms of the waiting time, so as I initially at referral to the TAVI came from our CAMS service, and I mean, I think a lot of people probably look at those timeframes now and think it's really short, but I was originally told it would be 2 months, then it became 4, then 6, then 9. I think it was about managing our expectations in needing to get to somebody who was a gender specialist, who had that advice. We weren't even thinking about hormone blockers. We were like, what is going on? What do I do? How do we deal and manage with that? Because I think, you know, you found a lot of that really distressing.
I would just like to add that in my experience, I was very, very lucky to get seen as fast as I did. I mean, I know people that at this stage now have been waiting 3 years for their first appointment to even be seen. So I couldn't even imagine at this point having my first consultation with someone who could understand and put into words how I feel. Imagine my first one being 3 years plus. I don't know how people would do it.
And I think it's how we frame some of those things. I think there's 2 things. I think, you know, how we frame being transgender as being kind of a thing that you would want to avoid at all possible costs. There's how we frame everything about people who are trans in the media is so negative and hostile, and it isn't. But even I think things like how we frame hormone blockers as being experimental. I totally understand that there's more research that needs to be done and the long-lasting impact, etc. And we went through all of that around bone density, fertility, all of those sorts of things. But at the end of the day, they are hormone blockers. And I think that can put fear in parents that it is a completely experimental thing, as if it's never been tried or tested on human beings. And I think, you know, I think that it was such a positive, life-saving intervention for you that did give you that space, that stopped periods, that slowed things down, that allowed you to kind of really consider. And I think it's, I mean, I'm probably not well placed to make a medical judgment on, are those two things, hormone blockers and cross-sex hormones, separate? They do different things, and they have different implications of whether or not they're reversible. But I think it's sort of, for a lot of people, perhaps it is the right pathway. And actually, I think we are trying to question and unpick that too much. For us, it worked.
And just can I ask you, Joe, this is a question for you really as a parent, because I see you see the suffering of your child and the distress and the possibility that the treatment is going to make them feel fundamentally different and better. And I appreciate your point about the language around an experimental treatment, but the reality is there's still elements of it that are unknown, as you say, like many people. Did you sit there and think to yourself, look, there is a trade-off here between the problem I can see before me and the unknown consequences of the treatment that's being advised?
Yeah.
Is that, do you think, is that the nature?
I think that's possible that you could see that like that, because I think that at the same time, there is so much hostility to trans young people, and Tyler was experiencing a lot of bullying and discrimination that was making his day-to-day life really impossible. And I think for lots of trans kids, I know lots of other parents, they often withdraw to their bedrooms for a couple of years because it's less problematic than going out into the world and being abused and threatened on a daily basis, which is what happened. But I think one of the challenges, I would say that young people and have to be involved in some of that decision making, because I didn't understand what was going on with Tyler, and I could bring the reasonable, sensible adult perspective to it. Because I think, most teenagers you think about your future fertility, well, rightly, they don't want to be thinking about that. But actually, I think it's so important that those opportunities are there for trans kids to be able to access that pathway if it's the right one for them, and that is explored robustly. And I think, it absolutely was, both at the Tavistock and at endocrinology at UCLH. So we were referred to the UCLH endocrinology team. And as Tyler said, they went through everything in the most minute detail. And I think the decisions we made were joint, were shared. As a parent, I think you need to listen to your child, and I think you need to listen to what they are saying. I think a lot of parents are scared of the fact, maybe because the world is such a hostile place, but their receptivity to whether their kids are trans or not is not going to stop their kids from being trans, but it's going to help them become thriving, functioning, happy adults who contribute to society. And at the end of the day, I've got you.
Yeah.
Well, Joe, Tyler, we're definitely going to come back to you. I want to make sure that we listen to some more people. I'm struck by one of the comments in the chat here from someone who's described themselves as a non-parent. It's well worth reading. I might actually read it in, but I'm going to come first, if I might, to Stella O'Malley. Stella, thank you for joining us. People may or may not have seen your documentary on trans kids, and it starts with it's trans kids, and the subtitle is "It's Time to Talk," and of course that's felt like a more and more resonant title in the last couple of years, where the debate around this has become much more heated, and the criticism of people on all sides of this has become much more fierce. But I just wanted to ask you about what you read into the ruling of the Tavistock itself, what you felt as you'd learned in terms of the nature of the NHS service for children or young people with gender dysphoria, having been such a student and so engaged in this subject. And you might want to tell people of your own experience of gender dysphoria as a kid, because it has some bearing on this.
Yeah, it does. The first time I heard about puberty blockers, I'm a psychotherapist, I was immediately struck by, had I been a child, had they been available when I was a child, I would have wanted them, and I would have been very intent on getting them, because I'd had such an extreme experience as a kid, and because I was such an intense person as a kid, and I was very strong in myself. And so when the High Court, they analysed over 3,000 pages of judgment around puberty blockers and the evidence around it, and they came to the conclusion that they weren't appropriate to give, certainly not easily the way that they were being given in the Tavistock and prescribed. I was very, very, very pleased, because I thought instinctively that they were something that would start people on a medical transition. And I have no problem with transition, apart from the fact that it carries a very, very heavy medical burden. And so what seems like a great idea in year 1, in year 13 might seem like a very heavy burden. And so for that reason, because of the heavy medical burden that transitioning carries, I do think we need to go very slowly. And I think the idea of people taking this decision from the age of 10, 12, 15 is uproariously wrong. And so the premise of our film wasn't should children transition or anything like that. It was very much the premise of, I'd had an experience from the ages of around about 3, certainly as far as back as I can remember, until about 10. So that's about 7 years of intense, what I would now describe as gender dysphoria, very uncomfortable with who I had been born into, wanted to be a boy, felt I should be a boy. I still think I would have been a great boy. And I went through puberty, and it was puberty that pulled me out of my distress. And it took a very long time. And had I taken puberty blockers, it would have derailed my development. It would have derailed my evolution, and it would have stopped me from finding an easier solution had I taken puberty blockers. And that would have been my nervousness for somebody like me. Now, somebody else who maybe gets their gender issues at a later age, like 13 or 14, to me, that is a very complex situation, because puberty and adolescence is an incredibly difficult situation. And an awful lot of people have an awful lot of psychological problems around that age. And it's very isolating if you feel that you can't cope with things around your body, because it's a crazy time. It's a really, really unsettling time. And to think, to be given an extraordinary, alluring solution, you can take this pill and be somebody different. And if you take this pill, you can have a new identity, a new name, a new existence. You can be somebody different. That is too alluring, I would argue, for most teenagers. And so though, just to go back to one point, I know you want to come in, but the premise of our film was, could it be that some children were like me? Could it be that in this extraordinary rise of children presenting with gender issues, could there be any children that, like me, who needed to go through puberty so that they could come out and be happy in the skin that they were in? And we need to discuss it. And sadly, we were blocked at every turn in trying to talk. And we were devastated by the level of stonewalling that occurred, because we thought we were going to have this film, just like Tortoise, is lovely, civil engagement. It's the only way forward. The only way that we can help children that have difficulty in their gender is by talking, discussing, and analysing. And sadly, we were stopped by doing that during the film. And we were only able to talk to people. Thankfully, an awful lot of trans people took part, but none of the organisations that purport to speak for trans people would take part in a film that wanted to talk about trans children. And that doesn't reflect very well on them.
And so there are two elements in the film that I wanted to pick up on, in the light of what Alexi said and the High Court ruling. One was, you described your frustration in the film at getting levels of data and information. And actually, as Alexi said, there was the frustration from the judges too, about the levels of data being collected. And you also talked in your film about the fact that, or certain people talked about an affirmation culture, that when you arrived for the treatment, perhaps quite understandably, these were young people who'd had such a hard time. They'd never had anyone say, yes, I understand. But that yes, I understand became a program of affirmation that then led to medical treatment. And I wondered whether, when you looked at the High Court ruling, what that made you think, A, about data sharing and information gathering by the Tavistock, and in the numbers of people going from puberty blockers to cross-sex hormones, what made you think about the observation you made about affirmation culture within GIDS as well?
Well, it's quite clearly that if you take puberty blockers, as it says, 98% chance of going on to cross-sex hormones. So for puberty blockers to be called a pause button, which is what they were inaccurately called until very recently, is inappropriate because they are the first step in medical transition. So that is a big issue. But yeah, it is very difficult to get research because there is very low quality research around this. And so there isn't a strong evidence base. And so therefore we need to be very, very careful, and we need to be careful about our language. And so when people start talking about the concept of trans kids, you need to be a bit more nuanced than that, because these are children with gender dysphoria who may transition in the future. And that's what they are. And to call them trans kids acts as if there's something within them that makes them trans. That's never been found by science, that nobody's ever been able to point to. It's a feeling in our mind. And for people to talk about suicide and self-harming and major serious issues like that when you're coming to children, there is never just one solution. And for a child to be given the suggestion, and for their child to think, because children of course think there's one solution because they're childlike, but there is never one solution. And to think that there is one solution, if you just take this, this will make you feel better, it's too bewitching for them. And so we need to be really, really careful that it's been phrased as trans kids and they felt suicidal and therefore they take this and they will feel better. That's not how mental health works. And that's not how we've been taught. Anybody who works in anything to do with mental health would realize suicide is a very, very complex and difficult issue. And there's never just one solution. It's just, there is never one solution to that. And all the guidelines around suicide will say there is not one solution. And to suggest it is not only misinformed, it's actually dangerous. So we have to be very careful with our language here.
Right. Stella, thank you. I'm going to try to bring in a whole bunch of other different voices. I mean, just to give you a flavor of it, as you were talking, you saw some people, you know, with exclamation marks disagreeing, and other people saying what you're saying resonated with them. And of course, Joe and Tyler, I'm going to come back to you because I saw that you had a few comments on what Stella was saying. But I'd like to bring in a few people who've been sort of making points from the start. One is a person who I imagine is not called Sue's phone, but is, I imagine, called Sue. Sue, I don't know whether you want to come on with a camera or you want to just talk to us, but can we hear you? Because you had, I think, a point about, a comment on the point I was making about affirmation, that I was misunderstanding that, but also a point about context that I saw from the chat about the numbers of people who are being referred to the TAVI and the Tavistock, and just to explain that. Can we hear from you?
Oh, thank you for letting me speak.
Oh, hello.
I think the first thing to note is that it's widely accepted that there's somewhere between 0.5% and 1% of the population in the UK is transgender. If you look at the consultation that came out for the GRA, it has 500,000 people as the estimate, and that's roughly based on 0.6% of the population. There is approximately 700,000 children born a year. If you take 18 years worth of children, that's about 12 million children. If you take that 0.6%, you get to a very big number of children. Roughly about 100,000 children should be presenting into the clinic at Tavistock. Just let that sink in. About 100,000 children should be presenting to the Tavistock with gender dysphoria.
Sue, forgive me. So I get very uncomfortable, to be honest with you, with these extrapolations, because you start with a number which is a percentage and then they come much higher. Is there evidence in other countries, because I imagine it's a global thing, is there evidence in other countries where you're seeing that kind of level of self-referral to gender identity development services?
So in Holland, there is significantly more. In Melbourne, there's significantly more. And the numbers are going up in every country around the world. And that's the key point that I'm trying to make, is that the fact that you're seeing an increase and then you're claiming that these big increases on small numbers are extraordinary, they're not.
Right, because
we should be expecting significantly more people presenting, not that these are wild extrapolations of small numbers. The real story is, why haven't we got more people presenting to the Tavistock? And the reason is that it's too long, we haven't got the services, people are self-medicating, going to different parts of the world, that it's an awfully long process. People are going to private services, because I know that's happening, because I run private support services, and people also, because they're children, it's a really difficult thing for them to come out. There is a whole load of societal issues that are stopping these things happening, and so it's not a surprise at all, those low numbers. It's quite the reverse. That's my key point that I'm trying to make.
Sue, can I just, what I was going to say is, I totally appreciate the point you're making, which is people shouldn't be surprised about the move from 97 to 2000 plus. They should be surprised that it's not 20,000 plus. I do get that point. But can I ask you the information and data point from the Tavistock? Because I imagine from your point of view, it's as frustrating as those people who are critics of the Tavistock, that there's not better information gathering, better data collection, so that you don't have to make this point as an assertion. It's clear and it's publicly agreed.
Indeed, they did a data study jointly with Melbourne, looking at the issue of they saw a correlation between media studies, media representation, and what was happening in terms of the spiking up of people coming to the clinic. And surprise, surprise, there was a correlation. But the reality is, how much funding is there for all of these studies? And that's part of the issue. But collectively, if you look across the world, there actually is a lot of data, far more than you would believe if you just looked at the UK. And there has been significant amount of studies that have been collected by the trans community. I can even point you to those that would counteract quite a lot of this paucity of data. What I don't understand in terms of the case, of the Bell case, is just how little of it was used to support this assertion that puberty blockers were experimental. They've been used for over 30 years. They're not experimental.
All right, Sue, I did want to, because your point has been made, I did also want to make sure that someone, as I said, who's come anonymously, an anonymous parent, makes in effect the opposite argument around the numbers, saying that actually you're seeing declines in the number of referrals as more people hear about people detransitioning, i.e. that speaks to the argument that actually there's an increase in referrals because it's become the case that more people are talking about it, and so there's a connection between the way in which society is addressing this issue and the number of referrals themselves. Your view in response to that?
So there's significant studies on detransitioning, and they're all very, very consistent. They show a detransition rate that is below 1%. Every single study is the same.
Okay. Okay, Sue, thank you. I've asked my colleague Phoebe. Phoebe, are you there? Phoebe did
Hi,
the
James.
research in those slides right at the beginning, just to give us some kind of data context. We've got lots of people who are eager to speak, and some of them have got direct experience of this, Phoebe. But I just wanted to just pick up on Sue's point about data. Is there any kind of sort of agreed data that's, when I say agreed, i.e. that's agreed by people across this debate on numbers of people transitioning, on detransitioning, the numbers that Sue was just talking about?
So I think something that we've spoken about, especially in the research for this thinking, and in my own research, is that there is a lot of data out there. This is true, and I think you kind of raised this, to that, but that's necessarily not for the UK, because each country clearly has its own service and the way that they approach treatment. If you go to the US, it's going to be different than it is in the UK, and I think it's been raised a few times, those increase in referrals, does that necessarily mean there's more people coming to the service, or does it mean that just there's more people aware of the service? But I also think it's important to think about the waiting times in that as well, because clearly, for example, if I was going forward to a service and there was a 2-year waiting time, that's not something that you look at and you say this may be an option, and that comes into it too. But no, in terms of data across the board, there's going to be conflicting studies. But in terms of the UK, there is another study I think was raised earlier in the chat, that's from the Netherlands, that does look at a similar long-term study of puberty blockers. But yeah, for the UK, that Tavistock one is the main one.
I'm just picking up, I can just see, for example, Anita Bennett's made this point, you've extrapolated from adult transgender numbers to children is a wild extrapolation. And just to be clear, Sue, that is one of the issues we're trying to get at, is a better understanding of the information available. I'm just going to bring in, if I might, there are a number of people here. I wanted to bring in Kelly J. Keane, who had something to say early on, and I'm going to come to Carolyn Linden, if I might. Kelly J, are you there? Hello there.
Hello. A couple of points, really. The first is that gender dysphoria is often a response to trauma. And so we really must keep in mind that these children are often experience distress, which may manifest as gender dysphoria, but isn't necessarily being trans, as Stella so rightly put it. And Kira Bell was sure that she was a boy at 14. She was certain she was male at 16. She was very certain she was a man at 19. And yet this is why we're all here discussing it this evening, because she then realized as an adult that this was all a response to distress and trauma, and she wasn't really trans at all. So I think we have to keep that in mind when we look at children. They can't really predict how they're going to feel at 19, 20, 25. And so caution is surely the best course of action when we're dealing with children.
Right, Kezia, thank you very much. I can see it's so interesting. This is an almost impossible conversation to have, in the sense that I see so many people's physical reactions on the screen. Some people, I just watched Jo shaking her head as someone else was nodding at the exact moment you were saying those things, Kezia. I'd like to come to Carolyn Linden, because one of the obvious questions to someone looking from the outside like me is to say, well, the court ruling has in effect delayed the use of puberty blockers until people reach at least the age of 16. And I think, Carolyn, if I read your point correctly, you were making a point around the fact that the court doesn't leave any other option available. So I wonder whether or not, Carolyn, you could just sort of give us your account of things, if you're able to join us. I think you may do so with your screen off, but
Sure. So I'm hiding, if that's okay. Just
do so. Fair enough.
Protect my child. Who's having a tough time now. So I have a trans-identified child who is on the waiting list for the Tavistock now, and I think it was interesting how this came about. And when I was told about this trans identity, my gut feeling was like, oh, this will be a passing phase. But then I decided to research it and to start from the point of, okay, this is my kid telling me this, so I'm gonna
and she's researched this, so I'm going to approach it as though it's true, and I'm going to look for evidence to back up this idea. And I mean, for background, I would consider myself center left. I've merged in Pride. I want full trans rights as part of human rights, and I would fight for trans rights. So that's my starting point. But I spent about 200 or 300 hours of time doing research, and I couldn't find evidence that medical and pharmaceutical intervention was beneficial for mental or physical health. And, I spoke to...
Sorry, Carolyn, you're saying that you could not find?
I couldn't.
Right.
And my starting point was, yes, this is true. This is my kid. My kid is telling me this. I love my kid. I'm not against it necessarily, but I haven't been able to find evidence. And, I've spoken to GPs, to endocrinologists, to scientists, to safeguarding experts, to child therapists, all kinds of people. And I think one of the GPs, two main GPs, three, let's say, that I've spoken to in depth, the one who referred us to the gender clinic said that she had to because colleagues of hers had been reported for not referring when they didn't think it was appropriate. So she was worried, she had to balance what her thoughts were about my child and her career. And
Carolyn, can I just ask you about that?
Yeah.
How nervous are you that once you enter the process in the Tavistock, the capacity to make choices will be limited because the expectations, the approach has a certain sort of process to it. So when you say that doctors were nervous about not referring to the Tavistock, that suggests a kind of pressure on medical practitioners to do a certain thing regardless of the individual cases. And I just wondered whether that's what you're saying, or I'm misreading what you're saying.
That's what I understood. And another GP has said the same thing. She has said that she has trans patients, and she says that for some people, transition is absolutely the right decision. But what she said is that 100% of her trans patients have underlying mental health conditions, and 100% of them still have underlying mental health conditions after transition.
Right. And
she said to me, she said, my daughter is diabetic and has to take insulin every day for the rest of her life. And she said, my advice based on that experience is, if you can avoid becoming a lifetime medical patient, it's best to avoid that.
Right. Well, Carolyn, I'm going to stop you, not because I don't want to hear more. I really would like to, but there are a number of other people who want to speak, and I want to make sure I bring them in. Please do. I know everyone will be sharing a good deal on the chat, and that's really, really valuable. I'm going to come back to Stella O'Malley, not least because you're sporting the old technique of putting your hand up. Stella, I'm going to come back to you, but there are a couple of other people, not least Liz Corkill's daughter, I'm going to come to in a moment. Stella.
I want to point out the real tragedy here is the waiting list, and people hanging around, especially vulnerable children, waiting and waiting and waiting to get to the great gender specialist is a really inappropriate thing to happen psychologically, because they think they're following some sort of yellow brick road and there's going to be a Wizard of Oz at the end of it. That's psychologically really bad, especially when you start looking at what is it that makes a gender specialist. It's a very self-identified, frankly, moniker. Because to become a gender specialist, there is no legislated degree programs here. I'm a gender specialist because I did an online gender course, and that's how most people became a gender specialist. And so all these children, vulnerable children, thinking, and the doctors and the psychologists and so many people who aren't au fait and don't really know very much about gender because it's happened so quickly that they're not up to date on it. They think the gender specialists have specialist knowledge, when frankly the knowledge base is really low. As Phoebe has pointed out, the evidence is pretty low. And so we have vulnerable children waiting and waiting and waiting to get to gender specialists who've self-identified as gender specialists. And what we really need to do is open out these services so these very vulnerable children get good psychological help, because that will help mental distress. There's a very high evidence base with that. So why aren't these children immediately being brought in and given good, proper psychological treatment so that their distress is calmed, and then let this other kind of thing unfold as it unfolds? But they need the help immediately.
But Stella, thank you for that. I want to, if I can, come to Liz Corkhill's daughter, who I think comes in under Liz, just because I think you were saying that you've just started treatment. Where are you? Hello there.
Hello. Sorry, we're both a little bit unwell, so we might sound a little bit a bit ill. But yes, I recently started treatment with a private provider because I have been on the GIDS waiting list for so long that they haven't been able to see me. I've been recently transferred to the adult clinic. I think I was referred in November 2018 to GIDS. So that's been, in a way, I've had no experience of the NHS system other than the lack of it.
And forgive me, so where did you go?
Well, probably don't say the provider, but I can say that we did some research, and Maya is now on blockers and estrogen, is that correct? Which is prescribed in what's called shared care with her NHS GP, who has taken a big risk to agree to do that with us. And it's a provider that's based overseas.
And Mara, what do you make then of the debate around the age at which you should be able to make this decision, the nature of taking an experimental treatment when, as has been discussed, it's not as though the treatment's never been used before, but it's not been used in this context for a great period of time. How did you come to make that decision, and what's its impact been so far?
Thank you. Yeah, I'm really glad you asked about the nature of the debate, because whilst I'm very, very happy to talk about my experiences with the medication, I think I just really want to make the point that, especially over the last year, myself and a good few of my trans friends have really struggled. Just the fact that every single thing on the news about about trans people, and especially trans young people, has been incredibly distressing for us. And obviously, I'm of the belief that healthcare should be more available to trans people and young trans people, because it's not like by the time you're 25 it gets any easier. You still have a 3-year waiting list. But yes, I just really emotionally struggled this year, even after being having access to this treatment. Just looking at the news and it being another it's a court case saying, oh, you might lose access to this, or it's another thing that another famous person is saying when they're not trans and they're not, 16 on the waiting list, and they don't know what other options they've got. And I go to a youth group with other trans people, and it's incredible to just be there with other people who understand and are in the same position. But a really sad number of the sessions are spent going over the things in the news, and I want to highlight the government ruling about not changing the Gender Recognition Act. For instance, they decided not to provide recognition for non-binary people on things like passports, which is an incredibly easy thing, and it would be an incredibly affirming thing to do.
And Mara, forgive me, there are a number of people I want to come to, so I'm going to stop you, even though I should just say, if we had a meeting this afternoon, I said, what happens if we get towards 7:30 and there's just so many more voices you want to hear? People who know me will know that I have a chronic problem with punctuality at the best of times. So this is going to be one of those conversations that I'm going to let run on a little bit. If people need to go at 7:30, please do. But I just want to make sure that there are people who are being kind enough to share their stories. I want to hear as many as possible. There's a lot to listen to. So if I might, I'd like to, Myra, thank you for joining us. And thank you to Liz. Can I just come to Emery? Emery, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, Emery, thank you. You said a whole lot of really interesting things in the chat, most of which I don't understand. So would you just explain what your you know, who you are and what that means?
Sure. Most of my points had to do with the U.S. version, I think, of the Tavistock Agreement, based off of the Harry Benjamin Standards of Care.
Right.
It was developed in the 1960s after Christine Jorgensen came out. There weren't a lot of standards for care at that time. There was really nowhere to get hormone replacement therapy. And I think that the US was remarkably progressive in developing certain guidelines for care. Say, for example, before I started hormone replacement therapy, I needed to have a psychiatrist sign off for me to allow me to do that. Before I got sexual reassignment surgery, I needed 2 psychiatrists to sign off and a year of real life experience living in gender presenting roles. And it's interesting.
Sorry, Emily, how old were you?
I was 16 when I first started therapy. I was 18 when I started hormones. And oh, you're going to make me do some math to figure out when I had surgery. But I had that in 13 years ago. So I'm post-operative more than a decade now. But I do find it really interesting that the Harry Benjamin Standards of Care in the US at least allows for people to get hormone replacement therapy without parental approval. I think that there's a lot more emphasis, at least from the standards I'm familiar with, for individuals to consistently demonstrate attributes of transsexualism and have that be recognition rather than age. I don't think that anyone is magically, mature enough to make a decision at 16 or 12 or anything like that. But at the same time, I do have a nephew who, at the age of 9, has begun to say that he's trans because I'm around and he's frustrated and dealing with obstinate defiant disorder and a number of different issues. He's also said that he's gay. He's also said a number of different things. And I do understand Stella's and other points that we can turn towards gender identity dysphoria as a convenient explanation for what's wrong with us. And I do think that needs to be acknowledged, as much as I think that people should be able to find more access to care, more access to puberty blockers and hormone therapy, all of that. I think that the key factor is people need to consistently show some signs that we agree upon. I've got a friend who was 7 when they figured out they were trans, and their parents have raised them, as a female happily for many years, and I applaud them.
And Emily, can I just ask you, because the more I think about this, the more I think that there's clearly no perfect or heaven knows easy answer to this, right? But one of the questions seems to me to be a trade-off between, or a choice between, early interventions with the risks that young people are not quote unquote ready or not capable of interpreting the significance of the choices they're making, versus later interventions, either medicines or surgery, with the risk that people undergo a great deal of trauma through their teens, and also that the surgery itself or the medical interventions themselves are more complicated. It's difficult both ways. Having experienced it and now looking at your nephew, where do you come down essentially on that choice?
I mean, you're right that there are risks either way. I do think that the risks are disproportionately slanted in the side of suicide and self-harm and depression that transgender individuals have. I think that there have been found much greater risk of not being treated for transsexualism rather than treating someone too early that should not have been. And while Stella, I also acknowledge your point that 98% of people who start hormone blockers continue. I think that that's because they tend to come to the picture understanding where they're going. I think that there's nothing to say that after puberty blockers, you can't stop them. There are long-term effects that do happen from that, but the risks from hormone blockers compared to the astronomical suicide rate and self-harm rate, depression rate for transgender individuals, it seems just completely disproportionate.
Can I just say, Emery, in the UK, I don't know whether you're in the UK actually, but in the UK,
I'm in the US.
In the US, so just to let you know, we've really tried to find those those figures on suicide. Obviously, you can see significant numbers on depression, so I don't want to minimise that or trauma, but the suicide numbers are really, really hard to find and ascertain. So we will look into the US to see what that says. Emery, thank you. I want to pick up on a few other points. One of them is actually, if I might, I was going to ask George Virtue if, I'm sure I'm pronouncing that wrong, I'm sure it should be George Virtue, but George, would you just mentioned trying to explore and understand as a parent what the what puberty blockers might do and the quality of information you were getting from the Tavistock. Are you there? I'm interested to hear your experience. Are you there, George? I can't hear you. No. Well, in which case, if I might, if I hear from George Virtue, I'm going to come back in a second. I said that I would make sure. I think I'm going to. I said that I'm going to make sure I wanted to come back to Joe and Tyler, and I know you've been kind of.
I can speak now. Sorry, forgive me for interrupting, but
I
was
muted. There you
I
are.
couldn't unmute. It was simply that I, a little bit like Carolyn Linden, I thought that I would be the parent of a patient at GIDS and sitting in one of their rooms one day having to decide about this treatment. And so I thought I'd better find out. And there was, I couldn't, I mean, there's a lot of conversation about it in society, but there's actually very little fact. And so I started sending FOI requests to the TAVI, and I ended up finding out quite a lot about their early intervention study, which is the sort of vehicle through which they introduced puberty blockers for under 16s in the UK. And it's the thing that they hadn't been able to supply to the court, and the court got rather cross about it. And then the TAVI published it the very day after the court judgment was published. And anyway, in the information that they prepared to begin that study, there was a long list of risks and harms and a lot of theoretical benefits. And they seem to be trying to juggle these two quite different objectives for using the puberty blocker. And one is to buy time for further consideration of next steps. And the other, which is really the original reason that the blocker was introduced, was to make the later stages of medical transition more successful, because the Dutch very reasonably saw that the later in life you begin this, the more difficult it is to have a life, passing as a member of your required sex, basically. And I think for reasons I don't fully understand, we've backed away from that. I think perhaps it's considered to be ethically unacceptable to recognise that. One thing that I regret that GIDS have never done is explain what this buying time does. What do they do with the time that they?
George, I've just lost you.
Oh, sorry.
I lost you there for a moment, but I'm gonna, because we're just coming towards the end, I wanted to make sure that Stella got to make a last point, and Joe and Tyler did too. So I'm going to, Stella, I saw you had your hand up. Do you have one final thought?
Yeah, I'd love to make one final thought. There's an awful lot of talk of suicide stats there on the talk, and it needs to be clarified that the suicide stats around trans have been very badly represented. There was one very bad study of 27 trans-identified children that 48% of them had attempted suicide, and for that to be extrapolated, the 48% is the rate, when there's a very long-term study for people post-transitioning who have a very high rate of suicide. It's a very, very vulnerable group, and people with mental health issues are prone to depression and suicide. And it is no higher in gender dysphoria than it is in other mental health issues. And so it shouldn't be flung around. And to be honest, I thought Tortoise would have flagged that and said, listen, watch out. Suicide is not something to be used as weaponized in an argument. And it's not really appropriate in this platform for it to be misused. It's really, I would have thought you'd know your research enough to know that it's not backed up by evidence, and therefore it shouldn't be used in this argument.
Okay, Stella, to be fair, the point that I was trying to make to Emery was exactly that point, that we don't have the data and information to make that connection. But I do want to, before I come to you, Joan Tyler, I do just want to come to one other person, Anik, if you're there. Anik, the reason is that you seem to be in the position of actually, well, personal experience, but also a student of the law in this area. Right. And I just wanted to put one point to you, which is one of the things that's really difficult is it's very unclear, you know, you make this point about the system, right, what the responsibilities are of the system and what the responsibilities are of individuals. And I just wonder whether or not in your thinking about this, in your research about this, you've got an understanding of where you think the decision-making should lie.
So where you think the decision-making lies depends on which journal you're reading. So if you read something which says the Journal of Endocrinology, endocrinologists say they should make the decision. It really depends on where you're looking. First of all, I'm not trans, I'm intersex, so I don't want to speak on behalf of trans people. I was just here to listen to what people were saying in general to try and find out their experiences, because the problem I was having is I was noticing that people, when they're discussing this issue, tend to want to end this idea of children being trans rather than focus on the issue of the fact that the system itself, going to GIDS, going to the Tavistock, going to your GP isn't the best place to go. So if I have a 10-minute appointment with my GP and tell them I'm having issues with my gender, they are just going to do exactly what they've done for the other people who've done that. And gone to them. Their advice in that 10-minute slot is to give them information about all of these different places. They will probably also have different meetings with you if they have the time, because we all know it's a lottery wherever you are, if you can have time with your GP to actually sit down and discuss all of this with you. But when should parents get to be involved in this decision is a whole different argument. A 10-year-old going to a GP and saying this, maybe there should be more scrutiny, but a 15-year-old or 16-year-old, it's not the same thing. And we tend to refer to children as if they're one homogenous group, and that's not true at all. So as someone who's a researcher in childhood and someone who actually talks to kids all the time of different ages, I volunteer at Great Ormond Street. I've had hormone treatment when I was 10, and I had surgeries from the age of 4 months. All of that was done without my consent. So when I look at people who actually want these things and are deprived of it, I think what is going on here? The people who actually need or want to have these things, which are reversible or can be changed, there's not enough support for them. And if anyone's saying that the research doesn't support it, well, then let's go and get that research. Let's try and find out how we can support these people instead of just saying the same thing over and over again, which is that there is no research.
Yeah, okay.
Depends where you're looking.
And thank you. I appreciate that there are so many other people that not least, I'm going to do, Tyler, forgive me, I'm going to do one thing. I'm going to come back to you, but I just want to make sure I've heard from Ruth's daughter. It's a strange thing. I don't know who what Ruth's daughter's name is. Ruth, you there? You're just talking. I just wanted to make sure, because you had raised it, you may no longer be with us. No, all right. So,
hiya, I've just put a message in the chat.
Yeah. Yes, that's right. In response to your message, that's why I wanted to.
I've put a second one.
Oh, did you? Which I missed. I'm sorry. I'm a bit of but could you read out my early message? Yes, I can. There we are. I am going to find it. here we go. I'm Ruth's daughter and I have Asperger's, and I struggle with the concept of identity being based on stereotypes. I don't want to behave like a girl because of my birth sex. It feels like social media is increasing the disparity between behavior of men and women. And if people don't fit with what they see, then it can feel very uncomfortable, even without gender dysphoria. Should society be looking at at the fact that there is so much disparity between what it is like to live as be raised as a girl or boy? Ruth, or sorry, I should say Ruth's daughter, thank you for that for that point. Tyler, I want to give you the last word, but I don't want, if you like, to give you a free one. I want to ask you what you say in response to those people who listen to you and will be genuinely impressed by the experience you had, the value of the treatment you had, and what it's done for you, and yet still be concerned that there is a public service that seems to be making a raft of decisions for a whole range of people, particularly very young people, right, which can have such a long-term consequence and impact on their lives. And there seems to be little public debate or scrutiny of the way in which those decisions are made. How do you square the value of the experience that you had and clearly the public concern, not just by kind of people who don't know what they're talking about, but people who do know what they're talking about the way in which the service is operated?
I mean, from my experience, all I can say with 100% clarity is my experience and how positive it's been and how much of a life changer it has been for me. And all I can say is that I fear for the next trans generation that comes along to have such, as Liz's daughter said, about how much the news is negative about trans people. I wish we get to a point in society where we don't view being trans so medically and surgically when it is just a part of my life. It's such a small part of my life. There's so much more to me than being trans. It's just one little part of me. And this whole thing about how I've changed as a person, I believe I'm exactly the same person as I was before I came out. It's just there's a little bits of details of me that have changed, but intrinsically who I am as a person and my personality is exactly the same. And I think that we need to change the way we're so hostile about how trans people living in society and how it's viewed so negatively. I think we need a whole new way of thinking about trans.
All right. Well, Tyler, for what it's
fantastic.
For what it's worth, I should say that you and your mum have made your own small contribution to that understanding, because actually just listening to you is massively helpful. I'll tell you what happens at the end of the thinking. The editor, in this case me, tries to piece together what you've heard and thought. And in this case, of course, there's such a divide that the people wish you to side with one or the other. The most overwhelming thing, of course, is just the point that Anik made, which is that this is so intensely personal, and yet we're trying to make judgments that are systemic. And of course, those things are fundamentally at odds with each other, understanding the individual and also understanding the response of institutions and systems. I do think that it makes an enormous difference to listen, Tyler, to you, Joe, to listen to Myra, to Liz, but also to listen, and I saw Katie was on the call, but also I have to say to listen to George and to listen to Carolyn and to hear the voices of an anonymous parent who's clearly concerned. I think that there are some institutional questions that are very searching for the Tavistock that I suppose have run as a thread through this conversation. One of them, which I think must be, sort of greeted by everyone, whether you come at it from Stella's point of view or you come at it from Sue's point of view, which is that the information itself is so contested. And if we're trying to understand something here that is so important, we do, to pick up on, it's more than just time to talk, it's time to really understand. And for that, there needs to be not the weaponization of data, but the provision of data. It needs to be actually a better understanding of the information. I do think personally that the courts in this case made a really powerful and important intervention, which was around age. I appreciate Emery's point, which is, there's a difference between age and readiness. But age seems to be very significant here, because we know that we change so significantly in our thinking, in our bodies, in our development through those years. And so that issue of Gillick competence that points to age, I think, seems very significant. But the final point I'd make is that the reason that this is not going to be resolved this evening or anytime soon is that we're talking about a set of decisions that the court pointed to that sits between children and parents, and we can discuss that as much as we like, but the reality is that the court ruling itself made an intervention that pitted the courts, judges, against clinicians and doctors. And I think until there is a public understanding of these processes and then a public agreement around the best way forwards, you're going to continue to see this contested. And that means you'll see it contested within healthcare services, you'll see it contested within the media, and I no doubt within Parliament, and you'll see it contested within the courts too. So I personally have found it an incredibly useful and informative conversation. I hope that people too, whether they agree with each other or not, found it was like the best editorial meeting, the best news meetings, where it challenged your point of view and you came out either with a different one or at least with a better understanding of why you think what you do. In either way, I hope that it proved to be a worthwhile use of your time, and I'd like to apologise for the fact that I used more of it than I promised, and I'd like to say a heartfelt thank you to Stella O'Malley, to Joe and Tyler, in fact to everyone who came on and talked so candidly and insightfully. I hope you have a very good evening, and we'll see you at Tortoise again before too long. Thank you.